I have managed the Ashcombe estate for 23 years. In that time, I have dealt with poachers, a disputed drainage easement that ate 4 years of correspondence, 2 outbreaks of cattle murrain, 1 fire in the south barn that His Grace's father caused himself by leaving a lantern too near the hay, and a particularly determined family of badgers that undermined the ha-ha wall in the kitchen garden 3 seasons running. I mention this because I want it understood that I am not a man who startles easily. I have seen most things. I thought I had seen all of them. And then Miss Adelaide Crane came over the boundary wall. The first time was in March. I was walking the western perimeter, a habit of mine on the first dry morning after a wet fortnight, when I heard it. Not footsteps, something more deliberate, a scrape, then the grunt of effort, then a pair of sensible brown boots appearing at the top of the old limestone wall that marks, or has always been understood to mark, the western edge of Ashcombe land. Then the skirt. Then the rest of her, dropping into the meadow grass with the practiced ease of a woman who had done it at least once before, which I later learned she had, in November of the previous year, when I had been otherwise occupied, and the underkeeper had said nothing, perhaps intimidated by the leather document satchel. She had a leather document satchel with her now as well, and a measuring chain. I will not pretend the measuring chain did not arrest my attention. "Madam," I said. She turned around. 20-something years old, plain dressed for outdoor work, hair pinned with the efficiency of someone who regarded hair as a logistical obstacle. Her face, when she looked at me, held exactly no surprise. She had, apparently, anticipated a reception committee. "You must be Mr. Fenn," she said. "I'm Adelaide Crane. My father was Henry Crane, the surveyor at Marin Cross. He passed away in November." "I am sorry for your loss, Miss Crane." "Thank you." She adjusted the satchel strap on her shoulder. "I'm here because my father spent 12 years documenting a boundary error in the 1802 Ashcombe survey. This meadow," she gestured to it broadly, as though she were already rather fond of it, "falls within the original Crane parcel as defined in the 1797 deed. The 1802 marker was moved. My father had the original chain measurements. I have them now." I looked at the meadow. The cowslips were doing very well. "Miss Crane," I said, "I have no doubt that your father held strong views about the boundary. However, you are currently standing on Ashcombe land, and I am going to have to ask you to return over the wall." She looked at me very steadily for a moment. "I'm not trespassing," she said. "I'm walking on my own meadow. His Grace the Duke of Ashcombe holds it to be his meadow." "Yes," she said, "I'm aware of His Grace's position. His Grace's position is incorrect." She had said this with such calm precision, not rudeness, not heat, but the dispassionate certainty of a woman who had done the arithmetic and trusted the result, that I found myself in the unusual position of having nothing useful to say. I said it anyway. I thanked her for her views, informed her that the matter was one for the estate solicitors if she wished to pursue it, and walked her back to the wall with as much courtesy as the situation permitted. She said she would return. I said I hoped she would use the solicitors. She climbed back over the wall. I watched her go, and then I stood in the cowslips for a moment, thinking about measuring chains, about the distance between 14 links in 20 years, about a survey done badly in 1802 and a woman who had come over a wall in March with the tools to prove it. Then I walked back to the house and wrote a note to myself that said, "Look up the 1802 Western Boundary Survey." I placed it in the middle of my desk where I would certainly attend to it. Then I attended to 12 other things and forgot about it entirely, which I have since come to believe was not entirely accidental. She was back in April. This time she had added a brass-fitted optical instrument to her luggage, a theodolite of some kind, though not one I recognized, and she was in the meadow a full half-hour before I spotted her from the far field. She was measuring, actually measuring, kneeling in the grass with a notebook, her skirt hems dark with dew, cross-referencing something against a folded map she kept smoothing flat, and which the April breeze kept lifting at the corners. She was holding it down with one elbow and writing with the opposite hand, and she had managed to accumulate a bootlace untied, and a smear of mud across one cuff, and a sprig of something tucked behind her ear that appeared to be common vetch, and she was entirely absorbed. I stood at the edge of the meadow and watched her for perhaps 3 minutes before she noticed me. It seemed unkind to interrupt while she was in the middle of a measurement. When she did look up, there was a brief and very focused assessment behind her eyes, tallying, I realized later, what she had managed to record before discovery, and then she put the pencil away and rose from the grass. "Mr. Fenn," she said pleasantly, "good morning." "Good morning, Miss Crane." She began to pack the theodolite case, methodically, each piece in its fitted slot. She did not seem distressed by the interruption. She seemed like a woman who had already accomplished the morning's primary objective and was tidying up afterward. This, I would learn, was characteristic of her. She arranged things in order of their importance and addressed them in sequence, and if she was interrupted partway through, she simply located her position in the sequence and waited patiently to resume. I found this quality somewhat alarming. It suggested that the boundary wall was not going to be a deterrent of any lasting significance. "The wildflowers here are remarkable," she said as she worked. "My father documented 17 species in this meadow. I wanted to verify his count. 22, as it happens. There is a population of common spotted orchid in the northeast corner that he missed entirely." Indeed. His Grace would mow this meadow in July. I checked the estate schedule with the farmers at Marin Cross. She closed the case clasps. 1, 2, 3. He has mowed it every July for 11 years. Common spotted orchids require a late summer cut if they're to persist. Early mowing eliminates them within 4 seasons. She looked at me directly. "They are the rarest thing on this particular piece of ground, Mr. Fenn, which is one of several reasons I would rather it were mine." I walked her to the wall. She climbed over it. She said, "I'll be back." I said, "Yes, I rather thought you might." She turned and looked at me from the top of the wall, with the first expression I had seen from her that wasn't entirely businesslike. It was small, something adjacent to amusement or to gratitude, I couldn't tell which, and I still can't say. Then she dropped down onto the lane side and I heard her boots on the gravel going away toward the village. She came back in May with a companion, or what passed for a companion, which was a girl from the village she had apparently borrowed for propriety's sake, who sat on the wall and ate an apple and showed no interest whatsoever in boundary surveys. Miss Crane was back in the northeast corner with a new notebook. I had her over the wall in 12 minutes. The borrowed girl ate her apple on the way back. The apple was from one of the Ashcombe Lane trees, I noted, but I let that stand. In June, there was a note delivered to the Ashcombe Hall door. It was addressed to His Grace the Duke of Ashcombe, and it was 3 pages long, closely written, with references to survey chain measurements and the 1797 deed, and a section of her father's notebook reproduced in fair copy. It was the most thorough and well-argued letter I had ever seen delivered on the subject of a meadow. I am not sure, on reflection, whether I had previously received any letters on the subject of a meadow, which may explain why the bar was low, but I read it twice and found it impressive regardless. His Grace read it in the library, he read it again, he set it on the desk, he picked it up and read it a 3rd time. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Who the devil is Henry Crane?" I told him. Was he a competent surveyor? By all accounts, Your Grace. He worked this county for 50 years. He was considered the foremost man in his trade between here and Exeter. And the daughter, she's been onto the land herself. 3 times. She will, I believe, come a 4th time shortly. She mentioned a camera. He set the letter down again. He looked at it with the expression of a man who has found a damp patch in a ceiling he was rather proud of, not anger, exactly. More the wary recognition that something he had assumed to be settled was possibly somewhat less than settled. His Grace was a man who liked things to be settled. He was meticulous about it. He had spent 8 years as Duke, systematically resolving every outstanding ambiguity in the estate's legal position. Because his father had been a man of grand gestures and vague intentions, and had left behind a number of situations that required untangling, and untangling them had given His Grace a decided preference for clarity. The letter was not clarifying anything, except in the wrong direction. "Write back," he said, "and tell her the matter is with the estate solicitors." "Yes, Your Grace." "And if she comes again, Fenn, bring her the legal correspondence. Don't just march her over the wall." "As Your Grace says." I paused. "Should I also," I said, "look out the 1802 Western Boundary Survey from the archive?" He looked at me. "Yes," he said, "do that." I wrote the letter. She came back 3 weeks later in June to photograph the orchids. She had a camera, as promised, a handsome portable thing with a leather case, the kind that cost considerably more than a surveyor's daughter's cottage income could comfortably manage, and which told me she had either saved for it carefully or regarded it as a professional necessity and sacrificed other comforts accordingly. Both, perhaps. She had reached the northeast corner before I found her, and she spent 20 minutes explaining to me, while photographing, that Dactylorhiza fuchsii required specific soil conditions that were present in this corner precisely because the old boundary ditch had drained here for a century, and that His Grace's 11-year mowing schedule had only failed to eliminate them because this corner of the meadow was too wet to mow efficiently, and that once the orchids were gone, they were gone. She said all of this while winding the camera and checking the light and adjusting the angle of the lens and taking 3 separate exposures from different positions. She did not pause once to indicate that she was aware of how unusual it was to be explaining botany to an estate steward while being escorted off disputed land. I told her about the legal correspondence. She said she knew about the legal correspondence. She had, she said, replied to it 3 weeks ago. She looked at me with the polite expectation of someone awaiting confirmation that their reply had been received. I said I would check with the solicitors. She said she would appreciate that. I walked her to the wall for the 4th time. That evening I told His Grace that Miss Crane had been in the meadow again, and that she seemed to be in correspondence with our solicitors about her father's survey documentation, and that she had expressed a hope that the reply had been received. He was quiet. "Has she threatened litigation?" "She has not threatened anything, Your Grace. She has been entirely civil on every occasion. She simply appears." He picked up his pen and put it down again. "She appears," he repeated. "4 times, Your Grace." He looked at the window for a moment out over the grounds, though from the library you could not see the western boundary. Then he said, "Pull the 1802 survey from the estate archive, Fenn. The original, not the copies. The one with my grandfather's annotations." I retrieved it from the deed room that evening. The document was large, folded in quarters, and had not been unfolded by the look of it in some years. The paper was brown at the fold lines. The ink was good, still clear, the kind of professional survey work that is meant to last a century. His Grace's grandfather had made notes throughout in a slanted, impatient hand, and the annotation that had interested me when I unfolded the western boundary section was in a different hand entirely. Neater, more careful. In the margin beside the stake measurement for the western perimeter, in small letters, moved 14 links E per JM instruction. I read it twice. I folded the survey. I placed it on His Grace's desk. I did not tell him at the time what I had found in the margin, which was a professional failing, and which I have thought about since. What I can say in my defense is that I suspected he would find it himself, and that he would find it more usefully on his own terms, that a man who trusted his own conclusions needed, sometimes, to reach them himself. He found it in 40 minutes. He came to my office at 9:30 in the evening, holding the survey document. Fen, he said, who is J.M.? I believe, Your Grace, that the previous land agent was a Mr. James Morley. He served your grandfather between 1799 and 1806. His Grace set the survey on my desk. He was quite still, in the manner of a man managing himself carefully. If the marker was moved 14 links east, he said, by instruction, without corresponding adjustment to the deed. Yes, Your Grace. Then Miss Crane's father was correct. It would appear so, Your Grace. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the candle on my desk had time to soften a little at the top. The orchids, he said. Your Grace. She said they'd be gone in 4 seasons, without a late cut. She mentioned something of that kind, yes. He picked up the survey and took it back to the library. He was in there until midnight. I know because I came past the door at midnight and the light was still burning. I did not knock. Some thinking is private thinking, and it requires the proper time. The next morning he instructed me to arrange an appointment with Miss Crane at Ashcombe Hall, at her convenience. She replied within a day. She was available the following Tuesday at 2 o'clock. Tuesday was the 8th of July. On the morning of Tuesday, the 8th of July, the weather, which had been building in a brass-colored heavy way since the weekend, broke at 11:30. Not a summer shower. A full storm, the sort the hills pile up when they have been collecting heat for 2 weeks, rolling in from the west, sky to floor. The kind that sends the cattle into the field corners and turns the lanes into streams within 20 minutes and the streams into small rivers within an hour. We had, by 12, a functioning understanding of where we stood. At 12:05, the young lad from the home farm arrived at the back kitchen door in a state that was partly rain and partly excitement. He had seen, he said, a horse and a woman in the meadow when the storm broke, the western meadow, the disputed one. I put on my coat. He had not been wrong. When I reached the boundary wall, ducking through the storm, which was conducting itself with considerable conviction, Miss Crane's old bay cob was hitched to the elder tree on the lane side of the wall, and she herself was not in the meadow. I found her boots first, or rather I found the gate of the gamekeeper's lodge, which was standing open, which was unusual because I kept it latched, and inside the lodge, wrapped in the old wool blanket that lived on the hook by the door, was Miss Adelaide Crane, who had apparently arrived at the western meadow at 11, gotten as far as the northeast corner before the sky fell in, and made for the nearest shelter. She was soaked. Her hair, which had given up the pinned arrangement entirely, was plastered to the side of her face. She was sitting on the wood-cutting stump, and she was looking at me with an expression of pure composure, which I can only say was either very good nerve or a complete misunderstanding of how wet she was. Mr. Fenn, she said. Miss Crane. I was going to come in by the gate. I had the appointment on Tuesday at 2. It is Tuesday, I said, but it is not yet 2. I was early, she said. The orchids needed there are seed heads forming. I needed to document the seed head stage before. She looked at her notebook, which was open on her knee and which was, somehow, dry. She had been sitting on it, I realized. I did manage to get the measurements I needed before the rain. The notebook had a damp corner on one side. She had not managed to sit on quite all of it. I stood in the doorway of the gamekeeper's lodge and looked at her, and experienced one of those moments that, in retrospect, have the quality of a door swinging open. The feeling that what one is looking at will have consequences one has not yet calculated, and that calculating them is, in some sense, already too late. You should stay until it passes, I said. The lane will be a river for an hour at minimum. Yes, she said without drama. I had arrived at that conclusion. I went back to the hall, getting considerably wetter in the process, and told His Grace what I had found and where she was. He looked at the window. The rain was going sideways. He did not, as I had half expected, tell me to bring her a carriage. He put on his coat. She's in the lodge on the disputed parcel, I said. Yes, Fen, he said and went out. He was back 2 hours later. His coat was wet through in the way that meant the lodge roof was doing its imperfect best. He said nothing immediately, which told me the conversation in the gamekeeper's lodge had been substantive. He was a man who said less the more there was to say. He changed his coat. He ate his dinner. He read the letters that had arrived that morning and set them aside, which he did not always do when there were more important things pressing. At 9 o'clock he came to my office and sat in the visitor's chair, which he rarely did. She knows every plant in that meadow by name, he said. Latin and common, both. I said nothing. She has her father's notebooks going back to 1803, 15 years of observations. Every season, every species count, every variation in the weather and the growth pattern. He looked at the survey on my desk. It was still there. I had not put it away. She sat on that wood stump for 2 hours in a wet blanket and showed me field work I would have said was impossible for a woman without institutional backing and 50 years of practice. She is a thorough person, I said. She had not finished the seed head measurements when the storm broke, he said. This appeared to be something he was still processing. She had 2 more rows to complete. She was going to go back and finish them after the appointment at 2. He paused. She asked me if I knew whether orchid seed dispersal was primarily wind-driven or carried by soil invertebrates. I did not know. She told me it was primarily wind-driven, but that the viability rate was low, and the colony's persistence depended far more on suitable ground conditions than on dispersal distance. She said my grandfather's drainage work in 1834 had inadvertently created a perched water table in the northeast corner. That was the actual reason the orchids were there at all, and that they would persist as long as the drainage was left alone. I waited. She thought my grandfather did it on purpose, he said, for the wetland plants. She thought he was the kind of man who would have known what he was doing. A pause. Was he? I asked. I have no idea, he said. I never met him, but I spent the last hour and a half rather hoping he was. He looked at the fire. She is entirely right about the boundary, he said. Yes, Your Grace. He was quiet again. The fire had been lit, because July storms are cold when they run long, and the light it cast across his face was the amber of an old painting, a good painting, not a formal portrait, the kind that catches a man in an unguarded moment. He looked like what he was when he forgot to look like what the county expected of him, a man who cared very much about his land and had spent 20 years letting no one see it. In that moment I thought, with the clarity that sometimes comes to those of us who observe from corridors and office doorways, he has been alone with that care for a very long time, and the woman on the woodcutting stump had, without intending it, seen it directly. What do you suppose the rector's wife saw? He said. I had been expecting this. I had, in fact, spent some of the previous 2 hours anticipating it with the specific dread of a man who has not done anything technically wrong, and yet understands that the consequences of the situation are about to expand beyond the gamekeeper's lodge. I believe, I said, that Mrs. Endacott's kitchen window faces the lane. The lane runs alongside the gamekeeper's lodge. Your Grace's horse was hitched to the elder tree on the Ashcombe side. Miss Crane's cob was hitched alongside it for approximately 2 hours. He said nothing. Mrs. Endacott, I added, is a woman of considerable imagination. Has she spoken to anyone? She has spoken, I said carefully, to Mrs. Hartley, the rector's wife, who has spoken to Mrs. Hartley's sister, who lives in the village and is acquainted with the postmistress. He sat with this for a moment. He understood county villages as well as I did. He had been born in one and grown up in one, and had spent 20 years watching the estate from one, and he was under no illusions about the velocity with which information traveled between the kitchen window and the post office. Fen, he said, did you leave the gamekeeper's lodge unlocked this morning? I looked at him directly. I am not always as careful as I ought to be, I said. He held my gaze for a long moment. He was a very direct man. He had always been a direct man. His eyes moved just slightly, something behind them that was not anger, not quite amusement either. Recognition, perhaps. The kind a man feels when he realizes he has been handled and is not entirely displeased about it. I see, he said. He went to bed. The next morning, the matter had reached Charing Cross. I know this because young N from the home farm, a boy of 11 who carried intelligence between the hall and the village with the dedication of a dispatch rider and considerably less discretion, appeared at the kitchen door before breakfast and reported, with relish, that old Mrs. Vane, the postmistress, had told 3 people that the Duke of Ashcombe had taken shelter with the surveyor's daughter during the storm, and that the door had been shut for 2 hours. Mrs. Vane's version had the door shut. The door had not been shut, but this is the nature of Mrs. Vane's versions. They arrive with decorative additions. By afternoon, His Grace had received a letter from his godmother, Lady Polton of Exbourne, who had heard from her maid, who had heard from a cousin in Charing Cross, and who wished to offer her warmest congratulations and to ask when she might expect an announcement. He brought this letter to my office. He set it on my desk. He looked at it with a man's look of someone who is working out his position on a piece of ground that has shifted under his feet while he was attending to other things. "Fen," he said, "I need to call on Miss Crane." "Yes, Your Grace." "To explain the situation." "To be certain you understand the situation yourself, Your Grace, it may be worth considering." "I understand the situation, Fen." A pause. Then, very carefully, "I find I am not entirely opposed to it." He said this with the flatness of a man stating a drainage fact. It was, for him, the equivalent of a speech before the full county assembly. I had known him for 23 years. I translated accordingly. He had spent 2 hours in a gamekeeper's lodge with a woman who knew the Latin name of every plant in a disputed meadow, and had her dead father's field notebooks dry under her skirt in a thunderstorm. And something had shifted in him, quietly and completely, the way ground settles after heavy rain, deeper than before, more solid, more sure of where it stood. "Shall I send word to Miss Crane that Your Grace will call tomorrow?" "Yes." "At what time?" "At whatever time she is not in a meadow." She received his visit on Thursday morning, in the sitting-room of the Crane cottage on the edge of Charing Cross, a cottage which was neat and clean and which was absolutely papered, where it had wall space not occupied by furniture, with her father's survey maps, room-sized maps, county maps, ordnance sheets with annotations in 2 different hands, the father's and hers, the father's in ink faded brown and hers in a brighter sepia that had not yet had the decades to age. His Grace noticed this immediately, I was told later. He had come intending to discuss the county's conclusions and the matter of propriety, with the considered dignity of a man who has an obligation to settle things correctly. He was distracted, almost at once, by a large survey of the southern valley that hung behind the sitting-room door, and he was standing looking at it when she came in. I know this because His Grace told me afterward, and because Miss Crane's neighbor Mrs. Perry, whose garden abutted the Crane cottage, watched the visit through the privet hedge, which she reported to the post office, which reported to End, which reported to me. Mrs. Perry's reports are reliable on physical detail, if not always on dialogue. By her account, which I take with appropriate seasoning but not without interest, the Duke spent 20 minutes looking at the survey maps before he said much of anything else, and she showed him 2 more that were rolled in a corner, and they were unrolled on the kitchen table, and he stayed another 40 minutes, and when he came out, he had the expression of a man who had been given something rather than asked for something. Which was, I thought, exactly right. He returned to Ashcombe Hall. He told me that she was not to be rushed. He told me that she had said, when he broached the matter of the county's conclusions, that she appreciated his concern for her reputation, but that if he was proposing purely on account of Mrs. Endacott's kitchen window, she'd rather he didn't, and that she was considerably more interested in the 1802 survey at present than in the county's opinion of an unlocked door. He had said, he told me this with a precision that suggested he had already considered it several times since Thursday, that he was not proposing on account of the window. She had said, then come and show me the original survey. He came to my office. He found me examining, I must say, a very interesting letter about drainage outfall on the North Field. He stood in the doorway. She asked to see the 1802 survey, he said. The original. She'd like to compare it against her father's field notes and make certain the chain measurement discrepancy is fully documented. That is quite reasonable, Your Grace. I told her she was welcome to come to the hall and look at it. Very good. In the map room. The map room has excellent light, I agreed. He walked to the door, he stopped. Order something decent for the tea table when she comes, he said. None of those dry biscuits Mrs. Havershaw sends up. Of course, Your Grace. She came on Saturday. The map room at Ashcombe Hall is a long room on the north side of the house, with east-facing windows and a table designed for exactly the purpose she was putting it to, the flat display of large documents, set side by side for comparison. His Grace had had the 1802 survey, the 1797 deed, and the chain measurement books from both decades arranged before she arrived. He had done it himself. I know because he sent the footman away and did it himself, which was not usual, and which Mrs. Havershaw mentioned to me in a tone I did not pursue. I had seen him in there on Friday evening after dinner, rearranging the documents for the third time. He did not know I had seen him. I was passing the room with a lamp. The corridor lamps are my responsibility at the end of each day, and the map room door was half open, and he was at the table with his sleeves turned back, moving the chain book to the left of the survey, and then to the right of it, and then back to the left, deciding how it should look when she came in. Deciding, I thought, what to show her first. He was not a man who arranged things for other people. He was a man who arranged things correctly and expected others to understand the arrangement. For him, the distinction mattered. She arrived at 10 o'clock. She had her father's field book under her arm and the document satchel over her shoulder, and her boots were clean, which told me she had not come through the meadow, which told me she had come by the road like a person who had been invited and was arriving as a guest. This was, given the previous 5 visits, a rather significant departure. I showed her to the map room and she thanked me. She always thanked me. Every one of the 5 times she had thanked me for the escort, which was a thing the Duke himself did not always do, and I left her at the door. I was not in the map room. My function was the tea table, which I managed from a position in the corridor. The door was open, for propriety, and voices carry in corridors that are not meant for servants to listen in, if servants happen to be in them for other purposes. She came in and saw the arrangement of documents, and she did not say anything immediately. I heard a pause, the kind that has weight to it. Then you found the chain book. It was in the archive with the survey, he said. I've marked the relevant page. Another pause longer, the sound of paper on the table. The measurement here, she said. This column, these are the original stakes. Yes. And this, rustling. Her voice had dropped into concentration, the particular frequency of someone matching things up. This is my father's field book, 1808. He found a stake, 12 feet west of the wall, buried. He dug it out. It had the Crane estate mark on it. Silence. He sent a letter to the estate, she said. In 1808, did you know that? I found the letter in the archive this week, he said. My grandfather's secretary sent a response saying the matter had been reviewed and the boundary stood as marked. More silence, then. They ignored him, she said, not as an accusation, as a fact arriving from a long distance reaching her at last. Yes. He spent 12 years on this. I know. She was quiet for long enough that I found myself holding very still in the corridor, the way you stand still when you have walked into a church at a moment you did not expect to enter one. He thought he was wrong, she said. In the end, he thought he must have made an error somewhere because why would they ignore him if he was right? He stopped trusting his own measurements. A pause. He was 71 years old. He was the best surveyor in 3 counties for 50 years, and he died thinking he'd made a mistake. His Grace said, very quietly, he did not make a mistake. She did not answer for a moment. I heard her set something down on the table gently, a deliberate setting down. No, she said, he didn't. Then she made a small and practical sound, the sound of a person who has decided, firmly, that she is not going to cry in a map room belonging to the Duke of Ashcombe, and who is reorganizing herself accordingly with the same methodical thoroughness she applied to theodolite cases, and said, "Well, shall we go through the chain measurements? I want to be certain the discrepancy is fully documented before any settlement is proposed." "Miss Crane," he said. She stopped. "Adelaide," he said. A pause. "Adelaide," she said, correcting him gently, telling him he had the right to use it. He tried it, the way you try the weight of a thing before you carry it far. "Adelaide," he said again, "I've spoken with the estate solicitors. The meadow is yours. I've already instructed them to prepare the documentation for the boundary correction. There's no further measurement needed. I am not going to argue what is clearly correct." A pause. "That is very straightforward of you," she said. "I find argument without merit wasteful," he said. "I've also instructed the home farm that the western meadow will have a late cut this year, August instead of July." The longest pause. "For the orchids," she said. "Yes." I believe this was the moment. Not a declaration, not a proposal, not anything that could be written in a letter to a godmother or reported by Mrs. Perry through a privet hedge. Just a man who had spent 11 years mowing a meadow in July telling a woman he had changed the schedule, and her understanding in the particular way of a person who has been studying his land for 8 months and knows it nearly as well as he does exactly what the change meant. It meant I was listening. It meant I have been listening for rather longer than 2 hours in a gamekeeper's lodge. It meant the meadow is yours, but I find I would like you to come back to it. She said after a moment, "That is very kind." He said, "Miss Crane." A pause. "Adelaide," she said. "Adelaide." He said it this time as though he intended to keep using it. "I find I should like to make you an offer, which I acknowledge the county has largely already made on my behalf, without my permission, and which I am grateful to them for in one sense and not in another." She did not say anything. "The offer is this," he said. "The boundary correction stands regardless. The meadow is yours. What I am proposing has nothing to do with the meadow or the storm or Mrs. Endacott's kitchen window." Still nothing from her. She was listening with the same quality she gave to measurements, completely. "I am proposing," he said, "because you have come over my wall 5 times and been wrong about nothing and right about everything, and because I would rather spend the rest of my life arguing with you about survey measurements than spend it without you in the vicinity of them." A long silence. "You're asking me to marry you," she said. "I am." "In the map room." It seemed appropriate. Another pause, shorter, the briefest of pauses, the pause of a woman who has already made up her mind and is simply allowing the moment its proper shape before she speaks. "Yes," she said. "Just that." He said, "Yes." She said, "Yes. You may finish the sentence if you like, but the answer is yes." There was a pause. He said, "I had rather more of it prepared." She said, "I know, I suspected you might. You may finish it if it would help." He said, "It would not now." She said, "No, I didn't think it would." I went back to the tea table and busied myself with the cups, because some things need no witness and no account. and I had already been in that corridor longer than I had any business being. I carried the tea in 4 minutes later, and they were both standing at the table, looking at the 1802 survey, which was spread between them and which they were apparently discussing, with the focused attention of two people who have found a comfortable thing to look at while they become accustomed to what has just happened between them. His Grace said without looking up, "The tea, Fen, good." She said, "Thank you, Mr. Fen." I set it down and withdrew. They stayed in the map room for another 2 hours. I know because Mrs. Havershaw counted. It is not only I who manages information on this estate. When she left, I brought round the carriage because the road to Marin Cross was uneven and she had come by foot, and it seemed fitting on this occasion that she go back in more comfort than she had arrived. She thanked me for the carriage and thanked me for the tea. She got in. Then she leaned forward in the carriage doorway and said, "Mr. Fen, the gamekeeper's lodge." I waited. "The latch on the east gate," she said. "It sticks. You should probably have it looked at before winter." She looked at me with eyes that were doing, behind a perfectly composed expression, something rather similar to what His Grace's eyes had done when he said, "I see," that same recognition, that same absence of displeasure. "I'll see to it, Miss Crane," I said. She sat back, the carriage went. I stood on the gravel drive for a moment, in the afternoon sun, thinking that she was going to be formidably good at this. I will say this, and then I am done. When I escorted Miss Crane, Miss Adelaide Crane, who would become the Duchess of Ashcombe at the village church of Marin Cross on a bright morning in October, when I escorted her over the boundary wall that first time in March, I did it because it was my job and the wall marked Ashcombe land. I believed that to be the whole story. I have since reconsidered the wall. The wall, as I have said, was moved 14 links east, by order of a man who has been dead for 30 years, on grounds we will never know. It was moved, and it was wrong, and Henry Crane spent his last years doubting himself because of it, and his daughter spent 8 months measuring and photographing, and hauling a theodolite over limestone rubble to put it right. She was right. She was right from the beginning. She was never trespassing on Ashcombe land. She was walking on her own. It is, I think, worth noting entirely without comment that on the morning of the 5th visit, the 7th of July, I left the gamekeeper's lodge unlocked. I had been forgetting to check the latch for some weeks by that point. I had, in fact, been forgetting it with increasing regularity since approximately the 2nd visit, when I stood at the edge of the meadow and watched her kneel in the dew with her notebook and her common vetch and her theodolite, and I thought, well, then, I am a thorough man. I am not, as a rule, careless with latches. I have managed these gates for 23 years, and I have never yet let a latch go unchecked that needed checking. What I am, occasionally, is a man who has served in this household for 23 years, and who has formed certain views about what this household requires to be complete, and who acts on those views with whatever tools present themselves. In this case, the tool was a latch. I have no apology for it. I have watched His Grace manage this estate alone since his father died, and manage it well, and manage it with the particular competence of a man who has convinced himself he requires nothing beyond it. He did not require nothing. He required, I had concluded by April, a woman who would come over his wall with a measuring chain and refuse to accept his position. He required specifically Adelaide Crane. His Grace has never asked me about the latch again. I prefer to let it stand as carelessness. The orchids that October had set their seed heads and were doing very well. The estate had carried out the late cut in August. As instructed, the home farm manager had grumbled about the schedule, as home farm managers will, but he had done it, and the northeast corner of the meadow was left standing until the last week of the month, when the seed dispersal was complete. I walked out to check it myself on the morning of the cut, and found the orchid rosettes already forming at the base, next year's plants tucked into the wet ground, ready. She walked the northeast corner of the meadow on the morning of her wedding, before the church in her good dress, a dress that was pale gray and well-fitted, and which she wore with the same practicality she wore everything, as something useful for the occasion, not as a costume. She had told His Grace she was going to do this. He had told her he would come with her. She had told him he could come with her after the service. She went alone. She came back with dew on the hem and mud on her boots, and the expression of a woman who has checked on something she loves, and found it exactly as it should be. He was waiting in the lane with the carriage. He looked at the boots. He said nothing. He gave her his hand. That, I think, was the whole story. What follows from it, the long decades of a marriage, the survey monograph she finished and published the following spring, dedicated to Henry Crane, surveyor, with an appendix on the 1802 boundary error that was, I am told, quoted in 2 subsequent legal proceedings involving disputed markers in this county. The boundary that was corrected in the official record books with a small formal note that Henry Crane's documentation had been determinative. The Ashcombe map room that acquired 17 new documents in the first 5 years and is, I believe, still acquiring them. All of that is theirs, and I will not account for it here. I only know what I saw from where I stood, which was a woman who knew where the boundary lay, who refused to be moved from it, who crossed the wall and kept crossing it because she was right, and she knew she was right, and she intended to prove it. She proved it. And the Duke of Ashcombe, who was by every account the most territorial man in 3 counties, turned out to be precisely the right sort of territory for her. I have managed the estate for 23 years. I expect I shall manage it for some years more. I have started checking the gamekeeper's lodge latch with rather more diligence. There is nothing in the northeast corner of the meadow that needs to be disturbed at present. The orchids are doing very well.